Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
When we usually talk about the boundary between ourselves and the outside world, we think of it as this, very literal physical line, right?
Yeah, like your skin or, your walls.
Exactly. Your front door. You lock that door at night, and you have this comforting certainty that your physical space, and honestly, far more importantly, your mental space, your private thoughts are completely your own.
Right. It's pretty much the ultimate assumption of modern life,
Mhm.
that your inner monologue is just this completely locked vault.
But then, you encounter a stack of documents like the one sitting in front of us today, and suddenly that vault looks, well, entirely compromised.
Oh, for sure. It really shakes that foundation.
Yeah, because we are looking at a landscape of claims today that is incredibly intense. It centers around some video excerpts from a speaker alongside these genuinely harrowing testimonies from individuals like Dr. John Hall, Catherine Nestor, and Connie Marshall.
Yeah. And we're going to look strictly at the narrative being presented here regarding the alleged use of remote neurocognitive technologies and directed energy weapons.
Right. And we really need to state up front to anyone listening, we are not here to validate the scientific accuracy of these claims.
No, definitely not. We aren't endorsing these viewpoints or taking any sides here.
Exactly. We're looking at this stack of sources as like a sociological and narrative artifact. Our mission for this deep dive is to impartially report on the claims being made, to understand the framework of these arguments, focusing specifically on the profound psychological and physiological effects these sources claim are being inflicted on regular people.
Because that's really the core of the testimony here, the physical and mental toll.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because whether you view these sources as whistleblowing or just, a manifestation of conspiracy and collective modern anxiety, they tap into basically the most terrifying question of the digital age. What happens when your mind and your body are no longer your own?
It is a dark thought. And to even begin to understand the psychological fallout they describe, we really have to look at the mechanics first.
Right, like how do these sources claim you can even hack human biology from a distance?
Exactly. And let's start with the acoustic part, because the sources point to a very specific real-world milestone. There was a $500,000 award from MIT given to a guy named Woody Norris around 2005 or 2006.
Okay, and what was that for?
It was for something called acoustic heterodyning.
Acoustic heterodyning. I mean, that sounds like incredibly thick engineering jargon.
It does, yeah. But the concept is actually this brilliant, if slightly terrifying, manipulation of physics. Because normally sound radiates outward in all directions, right? Like dropping a stone in a pond.
Right, it ripples out.
Exactly. But ultrasound, which are frequencies so high humans can't hear them, can actually be beamed in a tight laser-like column.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And the technique described here involves firing two slightly different, completely invisible ultrasonic beams at a specific target.
Okay, wait, so you have two silent beams hitting someone? How does that translate into them actually hearing voices?
So it's what happens exactly where those beams intersect. When those two distinct ultrasonic frequencies cross paths, they mathematically interfere with each other. They literally subtract to create a third, much lower frequency right at that point of intersection.
And that third frequency is audible?
Yes. So if that intersection happens right at a person's head, the physical structure of their ear, the cochlea, vibrates. They hear a sound or a voice crystal clear inside their own head.
That is wild.
And here's the craziest part. The person standing literally 2 feet away from them, they hear absolutely nothing.
So it completely bypasses the external environment, just bam, right into your head.
Exactly.
And the speaker in the source, he claims you can make a target hear anything this way, right? Like a soft angelic voice or a god or something specifically designed to terrify them, like a devil.
Yeah, that's the claim.
It's essentially a personalized, invisible radio broadcast beamed straight into your consciousness. But the claims go way beyond just these acoustic tricks.
Oh, yeah, they get much more complex.
Right, because the sources detail these contracts from around 2011 and 2012 awarded to the University of California for what they term electronic telepathy.
Electronic telepathy. which is quite the phrase.
It really is. And this is where the terminology gets super heavy because they bring up DARPA.
Right, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency.
Exactly. The U.S. military's research and development wing, I mean, they're famous for creating the precursors to the internet, GPS, all that stuff.
Yeah, serious heavy hitters in tech.
And the sources allege that DARPA funded programs to monitor brain activity at a distance, to actually read what someone is thinking, and then actively transmit complex messages back into the brain.
And they specifically mentioned the N3 program, right?
Yes, the non-invasive neurosurgical neuromodulation program. They claim it was run by a Dr. Al Mundy at DARPA, and that it allegedly uses these minimal electrodes to read and write brain function remotely, basically affecting your attitudes, your beliefs, your emotions.
Which, I mean, is a staggering claim.
It really is. And honestly, I struggle with the logistical reality of this. We are talking about sci-fi level mind reading and remote neural writing.
Yeah, the logistics are hard to fathom.
Right. I mean, if you've ever been to a hospital, you know it takes a massive multi-million-dollar MRI apparatus just to get a blurry static scan of a brain tumor.
And you have to hold perfectly still inside a giant magnet.
Exactly. So how could technology this precise and this world-altering be kept completely under wraps? You'd need thousands of scientists, engineers, test subjects. I mean, where are the leaks?
Well, the sources actually anticipate that exact skepticism. What's fascinating here is how they reframe the whole concept of warfare. They frame the human brain as the current and future battlescape.
The brain itself is the battlefield.
Yes. In their view, the entire paradigm of warfare has shifted. We aren't talking about weapons of mass destruction leaving giant, undeniable craters anymore. The explicit goal outlined in these documents is covert engagement with non-attribution.
Covert engagement with non-attribution, meaning you attack, but you leave zero fingerprints behind.
Precisely. Think about the strategic advantage there. If you can target an individual, subtly alter their behavior, or neutralize them without leaving any physical trace whatsoever, the secrecy maintains itself.
Because there's nothing to find.
Right. To them, the lack of evidence isn't a flaw in the conspiracy theory. It is the fundamental design of the weapon.
Man. But if they really can write data to the brain like it's just a biological hard drive, the immediate question isn't just can they do it, but what are they writing? What actually happens to a person's mind when that invisible data takes hold?
And the sources move directly from the technology itself into how it's allegedly deployed to break people psychologically.
And the examples provided are just incredibly dark. One of the most striking claims involves targeting political demonstrators or protesters.
Oh yeah, the crowd control aspect.
Exactly. The claim is that by using a specific pulse frequency, operators can make an entire crowd of demonstrators just suicidally depressed.
Flipping a switch on their mood.
Yeah, the source says they literally lose the will to protest and just want to lay in bed all day. Now, part of me wants to joke that I don't need DARPA tech to want to stay in bed. I just need to check the morning news,
Right, it's been a long week.
But the implication here is terrifying. It's not about arresting people or using tear gas. It's about neutralizing the very physiological desire to resist by overriding their emotional state.
It completely bypasses the intellect. You aren't persuading the protester to go home through logic or fear. You are physically altering their brain chemistry, so they simply no longer care. And that scales down to the individual level in a way that is profoundly disturbing. The sources allege that there are experiments deliberately designed to take an ordinary, entirely sane person and just slowly drive them to insanity.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because I have to ask about the motive. What is the metric for a successful outcome in these alleged experiments?
The metric they describe is horrifying. A success isn't just making the person suffer. A success is tricking an independent, completely unaware psychiatrist into diagnosing the targeted victim with schizophrenia, paranoia, or some other severe psychiatric illness.
So they use the medical establishment as an unwitting accomplice.
Exactly, by artificially inducing the exact symptoms of severe psychiatric illness, hearing voices, feeling paranoid, experiencing these wild emotional swings. They discredit the victims completely.
It's basically an impenetrable closed loop. If you go to the police or you go to a doctor and you complain that invisible beams from the government are making you hear voices and feel depressed, society immediately and honestly, understandably, categorizes you as mentally ill.
Right. The very act of reporting the crime provides the perfect cover story for the attackers.
The psychological effects aren't just collateral damage, then.
No, the effects are the weapon. The diagnosis traps the person. The source states the victim would spend the rest of their life in an asylum, in utter misery, completely silenced, while the perpetrators just chalk it up as a perfect, untraceable operation.
God. But according to the testimonies in her stack, this manipulation doesn't stay confined to the mind, does it?
No, it gets physical.
Right. The sources claim these invisible weapons manifest in devastating, tangible physical trauma. The documents describe the use of infrared devices that track a person, and they're linked to what they call pencil-thin microwave sources.
Pencil-thin, meaning highly, highly targeted.
Yes. They claim these beams are so precise they can target a specific gland, a part of the brain, the eyes, or even a person's heart.
Well, we really need to unpack the difference between types of radiation here because the sources specifically mention non-ionizing radiation.
Okay, what's the distinction there?
When people hear the word radiation, they usually think of ionizing radiation like X-rays or nuclear fallout.
The stuff that gives you radiation sickness.
Exactly. That type has enough energy to literally rip electrons off atoms and tear your DNA apart. But non-ionizing radiation is what your Wi-Fi uses, radio waves, your microwave oven.
Okay, so everyday stuff.
Right. It doesn't rip cells apart, but it does excite them, which generates heat.
So it's essentially the magnifying glass metaphor. You can take completely harmless ambient sunlight, but if you focus it through a magnifying glass onto a single leaf, it burns.
That's a great way to put it.
And the claim is that they are doing exactly that with non-ionizing microwave energy, targeting specific human organs.
Yeah. And the sources point to the well-documented incidents involving U.S. Embassy personnel in Havana, Cuba, and in China.
Oh, Havana syndrome.
Right. They frame those real-world events as clear examples of directed energy affecting human physiology. And they also bring up historical claims that low-level microwaves have been secretly causing cancers and leukemias since the 1950s.
But it's the personal testimonies in the stack that are really the most difficult to process. I mean, we have statements from Catherine Nestor, who claims she and her young child were subjected to remote neural monitoring and what she outright describes as electromagnetic torture.
It's awful to read.
And then there is the extensive testimony of Connie Marshall. She describes an 8-year ordeal, and the list of physiological effects she provides is just staggering.
It's a huge list.
She claims to have experienced extreme body temperature fluctuations like burning up and then freezing, seizures, heart pain, severe earaches. She mentions burning, swelling, and itching behind her eyes. Utter exhaustion.
The exhaustion makes sense if your body's going through all that.
Right. And she says her hair was falling out in handfuls, which she explicitly compared to having chemotherapy.
Wow. Hair falling out in handfuls. The physical toll she outlined sounds like a complete systemic collapse of the body.
It really does. She also lists extreme muscle spasms, involuntary limb movements, being literally made to fall down, and these bizarre physical marks like blue circles around the pupils of her eyes.
Oh, circles.
Yeah. She even invited the commission she was speaking to physically examine her eyes right there. Plus, she mentions V2K, which is voice-to-skull projected sound severe sleep deprivation. And on top of all the biological stuff, she claims her computers and fax machines were constantly breaking down.
See, when you look at Connie Marshall's testimony, the diagnostic waters become incredibly muddy.
Yeah, and that's exactly where I have to pause and look critically at the physiological claims.
Yeah.
Just based on the sheer, overwhelming diversity of her symptoms alone.
Right.
Like, if a targeted beam hits your heart, you have heart issues, makes sense. But when a person experiences literally everything going wrong at once, from hair loss to seizures to hearing voices to their fax machine malfunctioning, it makes it almost impossible to isolate a single technological cause.
It scatters the data.
Exactly. From a medical standpoint, it scatters the data completely. If everything is the result of the weapon, then you can't prove any specific thing is the result of the weapon. Which might explain why these testimonies struggle so incredibly hard to gain any kind of official scientific validation.
That scatter effect is definitely a massive hurdle for these claims. However, if we connect this to the bigger picture and look at the testimony of Dr. John Hall within these same sources, a totally different pattern emerges.
Okay, tell me about Dr. Hall.
So Dr. Hall is a physician who submitted a memo stating he has personally corresponded with upwards of 1,500 victims from every single state in the nation.
1,500 people.
Yes. And he claims they are all reporting identical complaints of non-ionizing radiation exposure being used for cognitive or behavior control.
1,500 people reporting the exact same bizarre cluster of symptoms. That is wild.
It is. That widespread shared experience of physical suffering is a phenomenon in itself. The testimonies really blur the line between an external targeted attack and a total internal biological breakdown.
Right, because the symptoms are so all-encompassing.
Exactly. Whether the cause is a literal, highly advanced microwave weapon, or perhaps a profound, contagious, psychogenic illness spreading through digital communities. The physical suffering being documented across thousands of people is undeniably real to them. The sociology of that mass shared symptomology is fascinating.
It begs a huge question, though. If these psychological and physiological effects are as widespread and devastating as the sources claim, and people like Dr. Hall have literally thousands of data points, why is nothing being done?
And that leads directly into the most expansive part of our source material, the systemic allegations and the claims of massive global cover-ups.
Right, because the documents claim that global intelligence agencies are effectively creating what they call a Stasi state, threatening fundamental human rights across the globe.
Yeah, the historical comparisons are very heavy here. We see direct comparisons made by Dr. Hall and Catherine Nestor to historical abuses, specifically mentioning MKUltra and the Cold War radiation experiments.
Let's contextualize MKUltra for a second, because the sources lean so heavily on it.
Sure.
For those who don't know, that was a real, documented, entirely illegal CIA program from the 1950s to the 70s. They experimented on unwitting U.S. and Canadian citizens using LSD, sensory deprivation, and psychological torture to try and develop mind control techniques.
It's the ultimate historical proof of the government experimenting on citizens without consent narrative. Because it actually happened.
It actually happened. And the sources argue that we are simply in the next generation of MKUltra right now. They claim that just as those historical experiments were done without informed consent, the current alleged use of electromagnetic weapons and what Dr. Hall calls EEG cloning in the home is just the modern equivalent.
Wait, let's look at that term. EEG cloning.
Yeah, they dropped that phrase into the testimony, but how is that even theoretically supposed to work in a civilian living room? I mean, an EEG reads the electrical activity of your brain, right?
Right, it reads brainwaves. Conceptually, within the framework of these claims, EEG cloning would mean using remote sensors to map your specific individual brainwave signature.
Okay.
Say, for example, the exact electromagnetic pattern your brain makes when you feel extreme anxiety or intense physical pain.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah. The cloning part would be taking that digitized emotional state and broadcasting that identical frequency back into someone else's brain.
Wow.
You'd essentially be forcing their neurology to mimic or clone that exact feeling of pain or anxiety completely artificially. So the argument is that the laboratories have simply been moved from a CIA basement into the civilian living room.
That is deeply unsettling. And the accusations here, they go all the way up to the top of the global health infrastructure.
Yeah, they spare no one.
The sources assert that Western governments, they specifically name the US, the UK, Canada, and Australia, are actively lying to their populations.
And not just governments.
Right. They claim bodies like the World Health Organization and ICNIRP, which is the commission that sets international guidelines for radiation protection, are complicit. They claim these bodies were keeping safety limits intentionally high just to protect massive telecommunications and defense industry profits from lawsuits.
And the speaker, Ciarcia, he escalates the language to the absolute highest extreme here.
He really does.
He claims that this industry and the government elements encouraging it will ultimately be responsible for more civilian deaths and suffering than all the terrorist groups in the world combined.
Which is a massive statement.
He even says it will cause more suffering than the entire Second World War.
Yeah, he explicitly calls it an untouchable genocide. He argues that scientists at the end of World War II were hanged for ethical violations that modern scientists are supposedly currently doing and just getting away with.
It's an incredibly heavy, dark accusation. It paints the entire modern scientific establishment as fundamentally, irreparably corrupt.
But Ciarcia makes this really interesting geopolitical observation regarding the public reaction to these alleged threats.
The comparison between the U.S. and Germany, right?
Exactly. He contrasts the American public with the German public. He expresses this deep disappointment that Americans aren't more awake to this. He theorizes that because the U.S. hasn't lived under a truly totalitarian rule since, the 1700s, Americans basically lack the cultural sensitivity to recognize an invisible surveillance state when it's being built right around them.
That's a fascinating point.
Whereas the German public, having the very recent living memory of the Gestapo, the SS, and the Stasi, where literally neighbors spied on neighbors and the state monitored absolutely everything, they were acutely aware of what a surveillance state looks and feels like.
They have a cultural immune system against it that Americans supposedly lack. And that historical trauma really informs how a society views its institutions. Because throughout all these testimonies, the most palpable emotion isn't just the physical pain they describe, it's an overwhelming, desperate frustration with the social contract itself.
You can hear it so clearly, like when the speaker says they can't get through to members of government, the Senate, the judiciary. These are victims who truly believe they're under attack. They're reaching out to officials who swore an oath to the Constitution to protect human rights, and they feel completely, utterly ignored.
Yeah, as one source put it, they feel like they're just a tick in a box.
A tick in a box. This raises an important question, doesn't it?
It all comes down to the complete annihilation of informed consent. By comparing modern wireless infrastructure and these alleged neuroweapons to historical institutional abuses, the sources are tapping into a very deep, historically justified distrust of government oversight and medical ethics.
It's a fundamental breach of trust.
Exactly. When the boundary of your mind, that locked vault we talked about at the very beginning of this deep dive, is supposedly breached without your knowledge, the very concept of consent ceases to exist.
It is the ultimate violation of the self. So, looking at this entire stack of documents, what does this all mean for you, the listener? We've walked through some intensely alarming, extreme claims today. But, even if you are highly skeptical of the literal existence of microwave weapons, acoustic heterodyning, and DARPA-controlled electronic telepathy, these sources brilliantly capture a very real, very modern anxiety.
Absolutely. The profound anxiety of the hyperconnected age, the fear that we are steadily losing our grip on our own biology.
Because think about it, we all carry devices in our pockets that track our heart rates, our sleep cycles, our exact physical locations at all times. Algorithms analyze our microbehaviors to predict what we want to buy or who we want to vote for before we even consciously know it ourselves.
Right. The data extraction is constant.
The primal human desire for bodily autonomy is violently clashing with a world that basically demands we be plugged in and continuously emitting data 24/7. These sources just take that underlying creeping fear and push it to its absolute most terrifying extreme.
Which really leaves us with a critical and perhaps very uncomfortable thought to mull over.
Let's hear it.
Let's step completely away from the claims of covert government weapons for a second. Think about the commercial technology that already exists right now.
Okay.
If the algorithms in our social media feeds or the ambient tech in our smart homes ever cross the threshold where our moods, our heart rates, and our purchasing impulses can be subtly nudged and influenced from afar, which some argue is already happening, how will society ever agree on what actually constitutes a weapon?
That's a great point. If the manipulation is completely invisible and the thought feels exactly like your own organic thought, how do you defend yourself against an attack you can't see, hear, or prove?
You really can't.
It really makes you look at the fortress of your mind a little differently, doesn't it? Maybe that front door isn't quite as solid as we'd like to believe. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, and we'll catch you next time.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.